The BBC knew it was coming, but perhaps couldn't have predicted Trump's lawsuit would land just as the government launches its review of the organisation's funding. But by last night, the writing was on the wall.
I'm suing the BBC for putting words in my mouth, literally. They put words in my mouth. They had me saying things that I never said coming out. I guess they used AI or something, and they got caught because I believe somebody at BBC said, this is so bad, it has to be reported.
A leaked internal memo written by a former BBC advisor, Michael Prescott, referenced a Panorama episode in a list of complaints about the organisation's output. In the programme, 2 sections of a speech made by Trump just before the Capitol Hill riot were edited together with this phrase,
"We're going to walk down to the Capitol and I'll be there with you."
Directly spliced into this phrase,
"And we fight. We fight like hell."
Which had been said nearly an hour later. Trump's legal team say the Panorama episode was false and defamatory, and that even before it was aired...
All right, John in the building, let's get loud. Trump's bank accounts were frozen or seized are false. The real story is a complex legal drama involving a massive lawsuit, last-minute maneuvers, and a surprising victory for Trump's legal team. The truth is more nuanced and interesting than the viral headlines suggest. Here's the headline you actually need to pay attention to. Trump misses a critical court deadline, gets publicly called out by a federal judge, and then pulls off a last-minute legal save that temporarily halts a massive financial records disclosure. This is real. This is documented. And it's happening inside Trump's staggering $10 billion defamation lawsuit against the BBC. A case that has already generated countless headlines and will continue to do so as it unfolds. The stakes couldn't be higher.
There was substantial evidence the BBC leadership bore President Trump ill will and wanted him to lose the 2024 election. They're suing for $5 billion for defamation and an additional $5 billion for a further count of unfair trade practices. The BBC has apologised but says there's no case to answer. The episode was not broadcast in the US and therefore to audiences in Florida where Trump's team decided to launch the case, though Trump's lawyers claim it could have been watched, including by those using virtual private networks or VPNs. This is far from Trump's first foray into media litigation, even if it's his first international attempt. He's currently suing the Wall Street Journal for $10 billion after it published a birthday card he'd allegedly written to the late paedophile Jeffrey Epstein, and the New York Times for $15 billion in a case the paper said was an attempt to discourage independent reporting. He sought and lost a defamation case against CNN in 2022, but several TV networks have decided to settle more recent cases, Paramount Global deciding to shell out $16 million over the editing of a Kamala Harris interview Trump said caused him mental.
The money couldn't be bigger, and the legal maneuvering couldn't be more dramatic. Let's rewind to the beginning of this particular chapter. A federal judge, Roy Altman, had grown increasingly frustrated with Trump's legal team. They had missed a court deadline, and not just any deadline, but a deadline to respond to the BBC's motion to dismiss the entire lawsuit. This wasn't a minor procedural hiccup. This was a significant failure to comply with the court's schedule, and the judge made it crystal clear that he was not impressed. He used language that any lawyer dreads hearing, calling it an apparent disregard of court deadlines. That's judicial speak for, your legal team really dropped the ball, and now you need to explain yourselves.
Anguish, and ABC News paying $15 million after an anchor said Trump had been found liable for rape, when instead he'd been found civilly liable for sexual abuse.
I would like to say it has been the privilege of my career to serve as the CEO of BBC News.
Both the Director General and Head of News of the BBC resigned in the wake of the leaked memo, so the organisation will now have to weather this latest scandal with no one at the helm. The Minister for Care, Stephen Kinnock, was asked what the government's message to Trump is regarding his case.
I think that it's now up to the lawyers to get involved in this case to decide how best to take it forward. But what I would say is that this Labour government is a steadfast supporter of our BBC. It is a vitally important institution. It's one of the greatest sources of soft power for our country. People around the world respect the BBC. It is, I think, a fundamental part of what it means to be British, to support our BBC, and we will always do that. So
the Conservative leader said the Prime Minister should get on the phone.
Keir Starmer.
Imagine the scene in that courtroom. A federal judge, robes on, gavel in hand, looking at the legal team representing a former president and telling them they've shown a blatant disregard for the rules that every other lawyer in that building follows, without exception. That's not just embarrassing. That's potentially damaging to the entire case. When a judge starts using language like that, it signals that patience is wearing thin, and that there could be consequences if similar mistakes happen again. Missing deadlines in high-stakes litigation is never a good look, but missing them in a $10 billion lawsuit involving a former president is particularly notable. Now, here's where the story takes a sharp turn into genuinely fascinating territory.
Claims that he has a good relationship with the US president. So it's time for us to see what that relationship is actually going to deliver for us. He should be talking to the US president and sorting this issue out. Otherwise, it's going to be yet another thing to add to Labour's advent calendar of misery.
So would you be standing up to the president in the face of these threats?
Well, I'd be asking him not to do it.
As the leader of the Liberal Democrats calls for Sir Keir Starmer to stand up to what he called Trump's outrageous lawsuit, it's a delicate moment for the Prime Minister, whose relationship with the American president has been carefully choreographed to navigate trade wars as well as Russia's war in Ukraine. This is an unprecedented moment for both him and the BBC. Joining me now is Roger Mosey, the former head of television news at the BBC between 2000 and 2005. Roger, thank you for joining us. The BBC says it's not going to settle, that it'll be defending itself. Is that the right decision?
I think what the BBC should be doing now is gluing itself to its lawyers. And Donald Trump is playing politics, clearly, even though he was wronged in the first instance. And the BBC shouldn't get into a political battle.
A magistrate judge, operating separately from the main proceedings, issued an order that sent shockwaves through Trump's legal camp. The Donald J. Trump Revocable Trust, the entity that holds a vast portion of his business empire, was ordered to hand over financial documents to the BBC's lawyers. We're talking about records going all the way back to the beginning of the year that preceded the lawsuit's filing. This wasn't some minor request for a few bank statements. This was a massive document production demand, tied directly to Trump's own claim that the BBC had caused him $10 billion in damages to his reputation and his business interests. Let's pause and really appreciate the scale of what was being requested here.
It has got to fight a legal battle, take the advice of both its UK lawyers and its American lawyers, and work out what the best way is of minimising any damage to them in this case.
And we have a question here of jurisdiction. We have a question of malice. Do you think that he has an ability to win on either count?
Well, Donald Trump is suing in Florida, and so far as we know, nobody saw this in Florida. And also, Florida was a state that he won by a mile in the presidential election. So it's quite hard to see that there was as much damage caused as Donald Trump is claiming. Also, I heard he was saying that this may have been done by AI. And although it was an edit that I don't think you or I would have made, it was still something that he said in his words in a speech. And you can argue about the overall meaning of that speech. So Donald Trump will obviously try to maximize the distress and damage he says he's suffering from, and the BBC has to be clear-sighted about how much damage it actually was and how restrained and constrained, in fact, the broadcast of that material was.
But what about his argument over malice, whether there was malice in this editing?
Financial records connected to a $10 billion claim are not something courts just casually order produced. These kinds of discovery fights typically involve months of legal wrangling, with both sides making careful arguments about scope, relevance, and confidentiality before any documents actually change hands. The fact that this dispute escalated to the point where a magistrate judge had to issue a formal order tells you just how contentious this fight had become. Watching this play out in real time gives you a front row seat to how these massive, high-stakes lawsuits actually work behind the scenes. And then there's the misinformation. Oh, the misinformation. If you've been scrolling through social media or watching certain YouTube channels, you've probably seen claims that Trump's bank accounts were frozen, that his assets were seized, that some dramatic financial crackdown had occurred. None of that is true. Not a single word of it. What we're actually dealing with here is a discovery dispute inside a civil lawsuit. That means it's about which documents each side has to hand over during the legal process. It's not a criminal case. It's not an asset seizure. It's not the government coming after Trump's money. It's a fight over paperwork in a lawsuit that Trump himself chose to file. That distinction matters enormously. A frozen bank account would mean Trump literally could not access his own money. That's a dramatic, life-altering event that would make front-page news around the world. What actually happened is a fight over which financial documents get shared as part of an ongoing legal battle. Those are two completely different situations, even though online headlines sometimes blur them together to make things sound more dramatic than they actually are. The difference between frozen assets and a document dispute is the difference between a hurricane and a rainstorm. Both involve water, but one destroys houses while the other just gets you wet. And then, on a day that would prove pivotal, something happened that actually worked in Trump's favor. Judge Altman granted Trump an emergency stay, temporarily pausing that entire financial record disclosure deadline. So, after missing an earlier deadline and getting publicly dressed down by the judge, Trump's team actually pulled off a real legal win, at least for now. It's a classic legal chess move. Stumble early, recover late, and live to fight another day. The question now is whether this temporary victory will translate into a permanent one, or whether it's just a brief pause before the fight resumes. Now, let's slow down and really understand what's happening in this case, because there are honestly a lot of moving pieces here. And getting the details right actually makes this story way more interesting than the exaggerated version floating around online. Let's start with the lawsuit itself. Trump is suing the BBC for $10 billion. And the core of his complaint centers on a documentary called Panorama that aired an edited version of his January 6th speech. Trump's argument is that the editing misrepresented what he actually said, and that this misrepresentation caused massive damage to both his reputation and his business interests. It's the kind of defamation claim that could reshape how media organizations handle editing and presentation of controversial figures. Now, here's the thing about lawsuits like this. If you're going to claim $10 billion in damages, you generally have to show real evidence that this kind of damage actually happened. You can't just say the number and expect the court to accept it without proof. Courts aren't in the business of handing out billion-dollar judgments based on wishful thinking. They require evidence. They require documentation. They require something more than just a plaintiff's assertion that their reputation was harmed. That's exactly why the BBC's lawyers went after Trump's financial records. Their argument is straightforward and, frankly, pretty compelling. If Trump is claiming his business was damaged to the tune of $10 billion, then his financial records should show that damage somewhere. Revenue changes, deal losses, reputation-related business impacts. All of that should theoretically show up somewhere in his actual financial documents. The BBC isn't asking for these records out of curiosity. They're asking because they want to test whether Trump's claim holds up under scrutiny. So the BBC requested a massive amount of material. We're talking about tax returns, financial statements, and ownership information connected to roughly 400 different Trump-connected entities. Think about that number for a second. 400 entities. That gives you a sense of just how complicated and spread out Trump's business empire actually is. Eventually, that original request got narrowed down specifically to records from a single year onward, which is still a massive amount of financial information, but at least a more limited scope than the original incredibly broad request. Let's think about why the BBC's lawyers wanted records starting from that specific year, rather than going back further or requesting everything ever. The documentary at the center of this whole lawsuit involved Trump's January 6th speech, and the alleged damage from that documentary would presumably show up in more recent financial activity closer to when the documentary actually aired. Any resulting business impact would have occurred after the documentary's release, so the records from that period are the most relevant. Narrowing the time frame like this is actually a pretty standard legal strategy. It focuses discovery requests on the period most relevant to the specific claims being made, rather than demanding an entire lifetime of financial records that would be harder to justify as directly relevant. Now let's talk about that missed deadline, because it's worth understanding exactly what happened there. The federal judge had ordered Trump's legal team to explain why they should not face penalties after failing to respond on time to the BBC's motion to dismiss the entire lawsuit. Missing a court deadline is a real problem in any legal case, regardless of who you are. Courts run on schedules and deadlines for a reason. They need cases to move forward in an orderly fashion. When a legal team misses one, especially in a high-profile, high-stakes case like this, it raises real questions about how carefully the case is actually being managed. The judge's specific language here matters too. He called it an apparent disregard of court deadlines. That is a pretty pointed way for a federal judge to describe a filing failure. It suggests the judge was not just mildly annoyed. He wanted an actual explanation on the record for why this happened. He wanted someone to stand up in court and take responsibility for the failure. That's not the kind of attention any lawyer wants from a federal judge. It's the kind of attention that can lead to sanctions, financial penalties, or worse, a loss of credibility with the court that can haunt a legal team for the rest of the case. Let's talk about why missing a deadline in a case this high profile is particularly notable, and why it stands out even more given what happens later in this story. When you're filing a $10 billion lawsuit, one of the biggest in recent memory involving a sitting president, you would generally expect the legal team involved to be running an incredibly tight, well-organized operation. Every deadline, every filing, every procedural requirement typically gets tracked extremely carefully in cases with this much money and this much public attention at stake. So when a deadline gets missed anyway, it raises a real question about whether the case was being managed as carefully as the stakes seem to demand. Now let's fast forward to the financial records fight, because this is where things get really interesting. A magistrate judge ordered the Donald J. Trump Revocable Trust specifically, not Trump personally, but the trust that holds a lot of his business assets, to hand over financial documents dating back to the period just before the lawsuit was filed. This order was tied directly to Trump's own claim about massive financial damage caused by the BBC's documentary. So the connection between the lawsuit's core claim and the documents being requested is direct and clear. This isn't a fishing expedition. This isn't the BBC asking for unrelated information just to be difficult. This is the BBC saying, you made a claim, now prove it. Trump's side pushed back against this order, and here's exactly how they pushed back. Trump's team argued that these document requests were overly broad and that they involved deeply confidential financial information. Their concern was straightforward. Once private financial information gets disclosed in a legal proceeding, you can't really put that genie back in the bottle. Even if a court later decides some of that information should not have been required, the damage of exposure is already done. That's a real, legitimate legal concern that comes up constantly in cases involving sensitive financial disclosure. Nobody wants their private financial information splashed across the public record, especially not someone with as many business interests as Trump. On the flip side, the BBC's argument is equally straightforward and honestly pretty compelling too. Their position is basically, Trump chose to file this lawsuit. Trump chose to claim $10 billion in damages. If you're going to make a claim that massive, you cannot then turn around and refuse to show any actual evidence supporting it. You cannot have it both ways. You cannot demand a huge payout while also refusing to open up the financial records that would actually prove the harm you're claiming happened. That's not how the legal system works. That's not how justice works. Let's think about how this tension shows up constantly in civil litigation, way beyond just this specific case. Anytime someone sues for a massive dollar amount in damages, the other side almost always has a legitimate right to examine the evidence backing up that specific number. Courts generally do not just accept a damages figure on faith. They expect the party making the claim to actually demonstrate through real financial records that The harm being described genuinely happened and genuinely amounts to the dollar figure being demanded. That's not some unusual legal standard invented specifically for this case. That's simply how these kinds of massive damages claims typically get tested in court. Now, here's where Trump's team found a clever legal maneuver. Instead of just fighting the disclosure order directly, they went a different route. They proposed amending their original complaint, essentially revising the lawsuit itself in a way that could potentially eliminate the need for all this business damages discovery in the first place. Think about the strategy here. If you can restructure your legal claims so that the financial records genuinely are not relevant anymore, you sidestep the whole disclosure fight entirely. Instead of having to keep arguing about confidentiality and scope, you make the whole issue moot by changing what you're actually claiming. And on that pivotal day, that strategy actually worked, at least temporarily. The judge granted Trump an emergency stay, which means the financial disclosure deadline got paused. The judge specifically wrote that Trump's proposed amended complaint created what he called a compelling argument, because amending the lawsuit that way genuinely might eliminate the need for this whole business damages discovery process altogether. That's a significant development. It means the court is taking Trump's proposed amendment seriously enough to pause everything else while it gets sorted out. Let's be really clear about what this stay actually means, and just as importantly, what it does not mean. A stay is not a final ruling. It does not permanently block the BBC from ever getting these financial records. What it means is the deadline is paused temporarily while the court figures out whether to actually allow Trump to amend his complaint in the first place. If the court allows that amendment and it genuinely does eliminate the need for the disclosure, this whole fight over financial records might become unnecessary. But if the court denies the amendment, or if it turns out the records are still relevant even with the changes, Trump's team is right back where they started, needing to hand over those documents eventually. Think about the legal chess game happening here for a second. Because it's genuinely a smart maneuver regardless of how you feel about Trump personally. Instead of fighting the disclosure order head on, which would mean arguing directly about scope and confidentiality, and potentially losing that specific argument, Trump's team essentially found a way to sidestep the entire fight by proposing to amend the complaint itself. They created a legitimate legal question the court has to resolve first before the underlying financial disclosure issue even matters anymore. That's a genuinely clever use of legal procedure, buying time and creating a new battlefield while the original fight gets put on hold. This is exactly how high-stakes litigation works in practice. It's rarely a straight line from filing to verdict. It's full of twists, turns, strategic maneuvers, and procedural battles that can shift the momentum in unexpected ways. This particular chapter happened to go in Trump's favor, but the next one might not. That's what makes cases like this one worth following closely, rather than just assuming the outcome based on a single headline. Now let's think about why the BBC's lawyers wanted records specifically from the year in question, rather than going back further or requesting everything ever. The documentary at the center of this whole lawsuit involved Trump's January 6th speech, and the alleged damage from that documentary would presumably show up in more recent financial activity closer to when the documentary actually aired. Any resulting business impact would have occurred after the documentary's release, so the records from that period are the most relevant. Narrowing the time frame like this is actually a pretty standard legal strategy. It focuses discovery requests on the period most relevant to the specific claims being made, rather than demanding an entire lifetime of financial records that would be harder to justify as directly relevant. Let's also consider the broader implications of this case. Beyond just this one specific lawsuit, cases like this one often set important precedents for how future high-profile defamation and damages lawsuits get handled. If courts consistently side with plaintiffs wanting to avoid financial disclosure, even after claiming massive damages, that could make it easier for anyone, not just Trump, to file huge damages claims without ever having to substantiate them with real evidence. On the other hand, if courts consistently force full financial transparency in these situations, That raises the stakes significantly for anyone considering filing a massive damages lawsuit in the first place, since they would know upfront that their own finances could become part of the public record. Let's talk about who benefits from how this specific development turned out. In the short term, Trump clearly benefits from this stay. It buys his team time. It avoids an immediate, potentially messy disclosure of sensitive financial information. And it gives his legal team a chance to potentially restructure the entire lawsuit in a way that could make this whole financial records fight completely unnecessary. There's also a public relations benefit worth mentioning here, separate from the purely legal considerations. Every time a court ruling goes in your favor, even a temporary procedural one like this stay, it gives your side something positive to point to publicly. That matters in a case this high profile, where both sides are not just fighting in court, but also fighting a broader public narrative about who is winning and who is losing this legal battle overall. On the other hand, the BBC does not benefit from this specific development, at least not in the short term. Their legal strategy has been to push for these financial records as proof that Trump's massive damages claim is either legitimate or exaggerated. This stay delays that entire strategy, at least until the court sorts out whether Trump's proposed amendment actually changes what evidence is relevant to the case. The BBC's lawyers are now in a holding pattern, waiting to see what the court decides about the amendment before they can resume their push for financial disclosure. Now, let's be fair and balanced about the confidentiality argument because it deserves a real, honest hearing. Financial privacy concerns are legitimate, especially for a business empire as large and complicated as Trump's, spanning roughly 400 different entities. Once sensitive financial information becomes part of a public legal record, there really is no putting that information back into a private box, even if a court later decides parts of it should not have been required in the first place. That's a real concern, independent of anyone's opinion about Trump personally. At the same time, the BBC's position deserves equal fairness here too. If you file a lawsuit demanding $10 billion in damages, courts generally expect you to actually demonstrate that damage happened. That's not some unusual or unfair standard. That's simply how civil litigation typically works in cases involving businesses, celebrities, corporations, or anyone else making a massive financial damages claim. Let's think about this from a completely neutral outside perspective for a moment, setting aside any opinion about Trump specifically. Imagine any business owner, any public figure, any company filing a lawsuit and claiming a massive dollar amount in damages. Would it seem fair for them to refuse showing any financial evidence supporting that number while still expecting a court to eventually award them that full amount anyway? Most people, regardless of their politics, would probably agree that seems like an unreasonable position. That basic fairness principle is exactly what is driving the BBC's argument here, independent of who happens to be the plaintiff in this specific case. So what happens next? Keep a close eye on whether the court actually allows Trump's proposed amended complaint. That decision is going to be the real turning point in this entire fight. If the amendment gets approved and it genuinely eliminates the need for business damages discovery, this whole financial records dispute could simply fade away. But if the amendment gets rejected, or if the court decides these records remain relevant regardless, Trump's team is going to be right back in the same position, eventually needing to hand over these documents anyway. It's also worth watching how this specific outcome influences the broader strategy going forward. Legal teams pay very close attention to cases like this one, especially high-profile ones that make headlines. If this particular maneuver, amending a complaint specifically to avoid financial disclosure, proves successful here, don't be surprised if other high-profile litigants start trying similar strategies in their own cases down the road. Conversely, if the court ultimately rejects this approach once the amendment gets fully reviewed, that would send a signal that this specific tactic does not actually work as a long-term solution, even if it managed to buy some temporary breathing room in the short run. And here's the bottom line you should walk away with. This is a real, ongoing legal fight full of genuine twists. A missed deadline, a judge's pointed rebuke, And then a clever legal maneuver that actually paid off, at least temporarily. It's not about frozen bank accounts or dramatic asset seizures. It's about whether Trump has to open up his financial books to defend a massive damages claim he made himself in a lawsuit he chose to file. The distinction between those two things is everything. One is a dramatic criminal action, the other is a routine, if contentious, part of civil litigation. Let's close by thinking about what this whole sequence of events actually tells us about how high-stakes litigation really works. Beyond just this one case, it's rarely a straight line from filing to final verdict. It's full of smaller battles along the way. Deadlines, disclosure fights, procedural maneuvers, each one capable of shifting momentum temporarily in one direction or another. This particular chapter happened to go in Trump's favor, the next one might not. That's exactly what makes cases like this one worth following closely rather than just assuming the outcome based on a single headline. This is not the end of the story. This is just one chapter in a much larger legal battle that is still unfolding. The court still has to decide whether to allow Trump's proposed amended complaint. If that amendment is approved, the whole financial records fight might become moot. If it's rejected, Trump's team will have to go back to fighting the disclosure order directly. Either way, the case continues, the stakes remain enormous, and the legal maneuvering will keep providing plenty of drama. So keep watching this channel because this legal battle is definitely not finished. And once the court actually rules on that proposed amended complaint, you can bet this story is going to make headlines all over again. This is exactly the kind of case where each new development shifts the momentum. Sometimes toward Trump, sometimes toward the BBC, and the final outcome is still genuinely up in the air. The legal system is unpredictable, and high-stakes cases like this one have a way of producing surprises right up until the very end. The real takeaway here is that the online narrative about frozen bank accounts was completely wrong. What actually happened was a fascinating legal drama involving missed deadlines, judicial rebukes, and a clever tactical victory for Trump's legal team. It's a story about procedure, about strategy, and about how the legal system handles massive claims involving powerful figures. It's not as simple or dramatic as the viral headlines made it seem, but it's far more interesting in its complexity and nuance. Understanding what actually happened versus viral fiction is essential. The Trump BBC lawsuit is still unfolding, and the real story is far more complex than the clickbait versions. I'll keep tracking the next developments.